Hey everyone, how are you all doing today? Tonight we're venturing back into the world of the Viking seafarers, warriors, and settlers who lived in some of the most unforgiving environments on Earth. While we often imagine them raiding distant shores or steering their longships through stormy seas, we rarely stop to ask, how do they actually survive at home, especially during the brutal winters of the north? Life in Scandinavia was a constant struggle with nature. Winters were long, dark, and merciless. The sun might rise only briefly before sinking again into the horizon, leaving villagers cloaked in endless twilight. Temperatures dropped far below freezing, snow piled up against the doors of turf houses, and rivers turned to solid ice. For the Vikings, survival wasn't about comfort, it was about endurance. They didn't have central heating, thick glass windows, or modern insulation. Instead, they relied on ingenuity, tradition, and sheer toughness. Homes were built low to the ground, often half sunken to the earth, with thick turf and timber walls designed to trap heat. Smoke from the central fire filled the air, seeping into clothes, hair, and skin. But it was also what kept frostbite from claiming fingers and toes. To us, the smell might have been suffocating. To them, it was the scent of survival. And beyond shelter, there was community, families, servants, and sometimes livestock, all huddled together under one roof during the coldest nights. The shared body heat was as essential as the fire in the hearth. In these long, dark winters, the Vikings learned the value of closeness, not just as kin, but as partners in enduring the hardships of their land. This was the world they faced, each winter a frozen battleground where nature itself tested their strength. And yet, through clever adaptations and sheer resilience, the Vikings not only endured it, they thrived. If the Viking longhouses were their first defense against the cold, clothing was their second line of survival. Unlike us today, who can simply buy specialized jackets, gloves, and thermal fabrics, the Vikings relied on what nature provided: wool, linen, fur, and leather. And they turned these raw materials into a surprisingly effective winter armor. Wool was the foundation of Viking clothing. Sheep were everywhere in Scandinavia, and their wool was spun into yarn and woven into heavy, durable fabric. Wool retained heat even when damp, making it perfect for snow and sleet. Underneath, people wore linen tunics that were softer against the skin, while outer layers were thick cloaks and coats that acted like shields against icy winds. Fur, however, was the real treasure of winter. Fox, bear, and wolf pelts were lined into cloaks, mittens, and boots. Reindeer and elk hides provided strong, warm garments. And for those lucky enough to trade with distant lands, exotic furs like sable or beaver added not only warmth, but also a mark of prestige. To wear fur was not just practical, it was a statement of status, showing that you could master both nature and trade. Boots were often made of leather, stuffed with straw or lined with fur for insulation. In the harshest winters, Vikings even wrapped their legs with strips of wool or animal hide, creating primitive but effective gaiters to keep snow and cold at bay. Children were bundled up just as tightly, since losing a little one to frostbite was a risk every parent feared. And in some cases, livestock skins were repurposed into crude blankets, reminding us that survival often meant using every single resource available. To step outside in a Viking winter meant layering yourself in nature's defenses: wool close to the body, leather to block the wind, and fur to trap the heat. Without these layers, the cold would not just bite, it would kill. Food was more than nourishment for the Vikings, it was survival fuel. In the long, merciless winters of the north, meals had to do more than satisfy hunger. They had to keep the body warm, strong, and able to endure endless cold. Without the right provisions, even the fiercest warrior or the most resilient farmer would wither. The first line of defense was preparation. Summer and autumn were frantic seasons of gathering, hunting, and preserving. Fish like herring and cod were dried or salted in great quantities, filling storerooms with food that could last through months when the seas were frozen and fishing was impossible. Meat from cattle, pigs, and sheep was smoked or salted as well, while hunters brought in game deer, elk, and even bears that was carefully stored for the hard times ahead. Grains were another cornerstone. Barley and rye, hardy crops that could grow in the northern climate, were turned into bread, porridge, and ale. And since bread could harden like stone when stored, it was sometimes soaked in broth or ale before eating, turning it from something nearly inedible into a hearty, warming meal. But perhaps the most important ingredient of Viking winter survival was fat. Butter, cheese, and lard were precious reserves of calories, providing both energy and insulation against the cold. Seal and whale fat, for those who lived closer to the coasts, offered even denser sources of nutrition. Meals were heavy, rich, and deliberately packed with calories because a Viking couldn't afford to be lean in a world where frost could sap your strength in days. Even the drinks had their role. Ale, mead, and fermented beverages were not only morale boosters but also safer than water, which could easily become contaminated. A horn of mead by the fire didn't just warm the spirit, it was a survival strategy. In the depths of winter, families would gather around the hearth, sharing meals that reminded them of the work they had done in warmer months. Every bite was the result of foresight, labor, and tradition, and every meal was a battle won against the hunger that stalked them from the frozen darkness outside. If food and shelter kept the body alive, the mind still needed its own defenses. Winter in Scandinavia was not just about cold, it was about darkness. For weeks on end, the sun barely rose, and when it did, it lingered like a pale ghost before vanishing again. The endless night weighed heavily on the spirit, and the Vikings had to find ways to endure it. Inside the longhouses, work never truly stopped. Women spun wool and wove cloth by the dim light of oil lamps, while men repaired tools, weapons, and ships for the seasons ahead. Children were taught skills, stories, and songs, small sparks of culture passed down in the gloom. Every chore had a purpose, and every idle moment was a danger, for idleness let despair creep in with the cold. But there was also joy in the darkness. Winter was a time of feasting and storytelling, when sagas of gods, heroes, and ancestors filled the smoky air. A skald, or storyteller, could turn a long night into a shared journey across oceans and through battles, binding the community together in imagination. Music, carved instruments, and rhythmic chants carried through the halls, their echoes a defiance against silence. Games, too, helped sharpen the mind. Board games like Hennafatafa, Viking predecessor to chess, were played by firelight, teaching strategy while also easing the weight of endless nights. Wrestling, riddles, and even playful mockery kept spirits high, proving that survival meant more than just food and warmth, it meant laughter too. And above all, winter was sacred. The festival of the origin of our modern Yule was celebrated with toasts to gods, ancestors, and hopes for spring's return. Ale was poured in honor of Odin, Thor, and Frey. Prayers were whispered into the night, and fires were kept burning as symbols of life's endurance against death's encroaching chill. To survive the endless night, the Vikings relied not only on strength and supplies, but also on faith, culture, and community. In the firelit halls, they built warmth not just for the body, but for the soul. When the darkness of winter pressed hardest, the Vikings leaned not only on stone, wood, and fur, but also on rituals that stitched their communities together. Survival was a practical matter, yes, but it was also psychological. Long nights could grind down the mind as much as the body, and in these moments, traditions became a lifeline. The hearth fire was more than heat, it was sacred. Families gathered around it not just to eat or warm their hands, but to tell saga stories of gods, ancestors, and heroes who had endured far greater trials. These stories turned fear into resilience. When a child trembled at the howling wind outside, a tale of Thor striking frost giants or Freya bringing fertility back to the frozen earth gave that fear a shape and gave hope that spring would eventually come. Music also filled the night. Simple instruments, flutes made from bone, lyres strung with gut, brought rhythm to the monotony of endless cold. A single tune hummed by a mother or played by a weary skald could soften the weight of frost pressing against the walls. Ritual feasts, too, had their place. In the dead of winter, when supplies were rationed carefully, it might seem reckless to share food freely. Yet the Vikings understood the power of sacrifice and community. The Yule festival, for example, was celebrated with fires, offerings, and shared meals that pushed back against despair. To eat and drink together was to declare, "We are still alive, and we will remain so until the sun returns." Animals, too, played their role. Livestock often shared the living space inside longhouses, their breath and bodies adding warmth. But they were more than heaters, they were symbols of wealth, survival, and sacrifice. A cow or pig slaughtered in midwinter was not just a meal, it was a promise that life would continue. Even their relationship with the natural world reflected this balance of struggle and reverence. The Vikings feared the cold, but they also respected it. To them, winter was not only an enemy, it was part of the eternal cycle. Just as Ragnarok foretold both destruction and renewal, the long winter nights carried within them the seed of rebirth. Here, in these moments of faith, fire, and fellowship, the Vikings endured the unbearable, For them, survival was never just about enduring the cold, it was about outlasting despair. Surviving winter in Viking lands was never the task of warriors alone. The burden of endurance fell on every member of the household, from the youngest child to the eldest grandparent. Each played a role, and without that cooperation, the fragile balance between life and death could easily tip the wrong way. For children, winter was both a time of fear and learning. They were bundled in layer after layer of wool, often to the point of barely being able to move. Yet they were not simply sheltered. They were taught. Long nights by the fire became classrooms where elders passed down sagas, practical skills, and the hard lessons of survival. A boy might practice carving wood into tools or learning how to tend a fire, while a girl could be taught spinning, weaving, or preserving food. To the Vikings, even children had to be molded by the cold, prepared to shoulder the weight of their world. Women bore some of the heaviest responsibilities. They managed a longhouse, controlled food stores, and oversaw clothing and repairs. A miscalculation in rationing could mean famine before spring, and it was often women who carried the burden of making supplies last. They were also healers, tending to frostbite, fevers, and wounds with herbs and remedies, and beyond survival, they were the keepers of morale through songs, stories, and rituals. Women ensured that the fire inside the hall was matched by a fire in the heart. Elders, though less able to hunt or work the land, were not seen as a burden, but as living repositories of wisdom. Their stories and advice guided the younger generations, and their presence gave continuity in a world where death was always close. Some accounts even suggest that elders willingly sacrificed comfort, or even food, to give younger family members a better chance at survival. To them, the future of the clan mattered more than the survival of the individual. This web of effort, children learning, women managing, elders guiding, was the hidden foundation of Viking endurance. The famed warriors may have swung their axes in raids and battles, but it was this quiet strength within the home that ensured the survival of their people during winters, when nature itself seemed intent on their destruction. For the Vikings, the cold was not just a physical enemy, it was a spiritual one. They believed that unseen forces stirred in the endless nights, and so their survival was tied not only to fire and food, but also to faith. The long dark months were seen as the domain of powers beyond human control. The biting winds, the endless snow, and the eerie silence were often attributed to the work of frost giants, ancient enemies of the gods who thrived in cold and darkness. Every storm was more than bad weather, it was a battle raging between divine powers, and if the gods did not hold the line, the frost might swallow the world entirely. Rituals helped maintain the fragile balance. Families gathered to make offerings of food, drink, and sometimes animals to deities like Thor, who could smash the frost giants with his hammer, or Freya, god of fertility, whose blessing meant spring would one day return. Even Odin, with his wisdom and sacrifice, was invoked in the darkest hours, as a reminder that endurance itself was sacred. But alongside the great gods, the Vikings feared and respected spirits closer to home. Restless ancestors, land spirits, landvita, and household guardians were all believed to linger in the winter dark. If not honored properly, they could bring misfortune. A small portion of food might be left out for them, or a quiet prayer whispered into the smoke rising from the hearth. Superstitions also shaped daily life. Certain omens, an owl's cry, a sudden crack of ice, a dream filled with shadows could be taken as warnings. In those moments, a family might adjust their behavior, stay indoors longer, or even hold a small ritual to ward off bad fortune. Yule, the great midwinter festival, was the climax of this spiritual struggle. Fires were lit, toasts were raised, and sacrifices made to ensure the return of the sun. To us it might look like celebration, but to the Vikings it was warfare of another kind, a ritual battle against despair and the creeping claws of winter. In their faith and superstition, the Vikings found armor for the soul. The cold may have numbed their flesh, but belief gave them courage, and courage kept them alive until the thaw. Even in the harshest winters, the Vikings could not remain locked inside their halls. Survival demanded risk, and that risk often fell upon the shoulders of warriors and hunters who braved the frozen wilderness when resources ran low. Hunting was perilous in the dead of winter. The snowdrifts made every step exhausting, and frost bit deep into exposed skin. Yet men ventured out in search of deer, elk, or wild boar, knowing that one successful hunt could feed an entire household for weeks. Traps were laid for smaller animals like foxes or hares, whose pelts also provided warmth. Sometimes these hunts stretched into days, with hunters camping beneath the stars or inside hastily built snow shelters. relying on their skill and endurance to outlast the biting cold. Warriors, too, were not idle. Villagers needed protection, for hunger could drive even neighbors to desperation. Bandits, rival clans, or ambitious chieftains might strike when people were weakest, hoping to seize food or livestock. Thus, even in the silent snows, guards kept watch, their breath misting in the air as they stood with spear or axe in hand. To fail in vigilance was to invite ruin upon the entire community. Gathering wood and fuel was another constant necessity. Fires could not burn without logs, and so men and older boys ventured into frozen forests with axes, dragging back timber through ice and snow. Each trip was a battle against exhaustion, but without fire, the village would wither, and sometimes, the wilderness itself fought back. Wolves, driven by hunger, grew bold in winter, stalking livestock or even men. Bears roused from uneasy hibernation could lash out with deadly ferocity. For the Viking hunter or guard, survival meant not just enduring the cold, but facing the predators who also struggled to live through the endless night. In these moments, the Viking ideal of toughness was not a matter of choice, it was necessity. To step into the frozen wild was to gamble with death, but without that gamble, no village could last until spring. For a people defined by their ships, winter struck at the very core of Viking life. The long ships that carried them across oceans and into legend became useless when ice gripped the fjords and storms churned the seas into chaos. The same waters that had brought them wealth and fame now became deadly barriers. When the fjords froze over, travel by boat stopped entirely. Long ships were hauled ashore and turned upside down, their hulls serving as makeshift shelters or storage. Sailors who had once chased horizons now stayed landlocked, mending nets, repairing holes, and carving new tools while waiting for the thaw. The sea, which had always promised freedom, became a prison of ice. For those desperate enough to venture out, the risks were enormous. Winter storms came with little warning, whipping the waves into towering walls of water. A ship caught in such fury could vanish in minutes, swallowed whole by the North Sea, even if the vessel survived. The bitter wind could freeze fingers to oars and turn sails into sheets of ice. Few dared to risk it. But the sea was not only a danger, it was a provider. Inlets and coastlines still offered fish beneath the ice. Brave men cut holes in the frozen waters to set lines and nets, hoping for cod or herring to bolster dwindling supplies. On some coasts, seal hunts continued through the darkest months, their fat and hides prized for both food and warmth. Yet these hunts were treacherous, demanding long hours on unstable ice, where one wrong step could plunge a man into freezing waters from which there was no escape. The sea's silence in winter was a reminder that the Vikings, for all their mastery of navigation and seafaring, were still at the mercy of nature. No amount of skill or bravery could command the frozen waves. All they could do was wait, endure, and prepare for the day the ice would break and the horizon would open once more. After months of darkness, frost, and endless struggle, the first signs of spring felt like a miracle to the Vikings. The rivers cracked open, ice breaking apart with sounds like thunder. Snow melted into rushing streams that fed the soil, and the pale sun lingered longer each day, chasing away the long shadow of winter. For the Vikings, this was not just a change of season, it was the renewal of life itself. Crops could be sown again, livestock could graze in the pastures, and travel across land and sea became possible once more. The world that had seemed frozen in death stirred awake, green pushing through white, and the people followed nature's lead with festivals of gratitude and joy. Spring rituals often honored Freya, the god of fertility and prosperity, whose blessing was believed to bring healthy crops and fruitful harvests. Offerings of food, drink, and sometimes animal sacrifices were made to ensure abundance in the warmer months ahead. Fires were lit, not for warmth now, but for celebration, symbols of life rekindled after its near extinction. Communities also turned their attention outward. Trade routes reopened, warriors and sailors once again prepared their longships, and tales of new voyages spread from hall to hall. If winter had been about survival, spring was about opportunity. The people who had endured together now looked to the future with renewed ambition, sharpened by the memory of hardship. The return of the sun was not taken for granted. It was cherished as proof that endurance had meaning, that no matter how deep the dark, life always found a way back to light. The Vikings survived winters that would break most of us today, not because they were superhuman, but because they understood the balance between strength, faith, and community. Their lives were a constant negotiation with nature, enduring the cold, feeding the hungry, guarding the weak, and believing in the return of light when all seemed lost. Their resilience teaches us that survival is never just about resisting hardship, it is about finding meaning within it. The fire in the hearth mattered as much as the fire in the spirit. The shared story mattered as much as the shared meal. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson the Vikings leave us, that even in the longest night, hope can endure if we choose to carry it together. So let me leave you with a question. When the long winters of our own lives arrive, be they of sorrow, doubt, or hardship, what fire will you keep burning to guide you through the dark?